First and foremost, the 9010 device, the 9090 device, or the 9070 device, and I don't know which one of those three or all three that you're talking about, but all of them, first and foremost, are cellular routers. That's their core. And then they have capabilities for wide area network access as well. So depending on the configuration and the customer's needs, it can be set up for internet access as primary, cellular as failover. That's one configuration. The 9090 box and the 9010 box have dual cellular capability. So you could have internet as primary and cellular carrier number 1 as secondary, and cellular carrier number 2 as tertiary. Or you could say, no, I want cellular number 1 to be primary and internet to be secondary and cellular number 2 tertiary. So it's there, but fundamentally there's just two basic communications mediums available to you. One is cellular, one is internet. So that's the first piece of this. And then just to kind of level set this thing, it will do, in its native format, it'll do voice service, or it will do data service, or it will do facsimile, fax, or it'll do alarms. And then you can have ring down, for those of you that know what a ring down circuit is, and elevator phones. There's all other kinds of things you can do with it. But in the normal environment, it's going to be either a voice or an alarm or a fax or a modem line. Those are the typicals. And in your specific application, it's going to be tied to an alarm system, I'm assuming, as primary function. So in that mode, then the question is, all right, and we could get into the type of alarms. Is it a AA Berg UL, or is it a basic fire, or is it a residential Berg? What is it? And I would guess that the lion's share is going to be business fire, is what you're most concerned about. That's an assumption I'm making. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. So in its basic function, I'm going to make an assumption that the lion's share of what you're doing is to go into an existing installation that has a fire panel in it, and whether it's a grocery store or whether it's an apartment complex or an office building or whatever it is, if it has a fire panel in it, it's going to have either one or two phone lines hooked to it, depending on when it was installed and what the communications medium is today. And that's going to be the driving factor as to how you're going to behave if you're going to replace those existing lines without doing some extra work. So I'm going to just kind of make that statement to you. So in its simplest form, if I approached a complex that had a centralized alarm system, and it had two phone lines that were supervising one another, two POTS lines, and the basic principle being that if one of the POTS lines stops working, the other one's looking for that, and it's looking for voltage, and if the voltage drops, it recognizes, it enunciates trouble locally, and it sends out a signal to the central station, says comms is down on line 1, or vice versa. So what you're going to do in that situation is if you're replacing the POTS lines, either one or both, then you're going to use one or two lines, depending on how that current system is configured, and you're going to lift and lay from the existing landline POTS, central office space POTS, into the POTS in a box device. And the POTS in a box device then takes over the communications requirements by provisioning the functional equivalent of a central office POTS line. And you can't think of it in terms of, oh, gee, it's cellular, or gee, it's internet. It's a listed device that provides central office dial tone. And that's the high level view. And there's some caveats with that, obviously some things that you need to do and what have you. But functionally, that's how it's supposed to work. The POTS in a box is a replacement. It's a piece of telecommunications network equipment. It's always wired on the network side, the standard network interface, the SNI, or the NI, depending on what you want to call it. So it's always on the telco side of the block. It's never on the customer side of the block. And that's a critical distinction you need to appreciate. It carries a UL listing under 60950-1, which among other things is listed as telecommunications network equipment. It's not listed under UL 864, which is traditionally an alarm dialer or a DACT, a communicator. It's not one of those. It doesn't dial. It provides dial tone and carries the traffic. It's not a modem from an alarm system. It's not a dialer or a communicator from a traditional alarm system. It's a part of the provision process to give you central office dial tone to complete over the public switch telephone network. And look up 60950-1 and look at the description of it. And it talks about being a cellular router and a bunch of other things. Or actually, it talks about a network appliance as the main piece of it, telecommunications network equipment. And then if you drill down through that wonderful UL fun reading document and find note number 2, it's carried in the document. And it's very specifically calls out approved for fire service. That's what you need to know. Now, fire marshals are going to look at it and say, well, it doesn't have an 864 on it, you can't use it. Well, that's true, but we're not wired on the customer side of the block, we're on the telco side of the block. So we're taking the existing dial tone, which is normally provisioned by copper wires, and we're moving it over to a different medium, vis-a-vis coaxial, perhaps, if it's internet connected or cellular. And then we could get into all kinds of discussions about supervision and the 60-minute rule for supervision on cellular and all of those kinds of things. But fundamentally, those don't apply for network equipment. They apply for customer equipment. Once you understand that distinction, then it's pretty straightforward. You got 2 lines today, you'll have 2 lines tomorrow. It's a brand new installation, brand spanking new, didn't have an alarm system before. You can get by with a single line, providing you change the supervision rule and it's checking in once an hour. You should know that the device normally, it's configurable, but normally it's intended that if you had 2 lines, for example, and the device lost registration on one of those lines, or both of them, but let's start with one, then normally what happens is that it drops voltage. And what does an alarm panel do if it doesn't see negative 48 volt DC? It sets off a trouble signal and says, I've lost comms. And then it communicates out on the other line to say, I have no communications. So, you know, that's optional, obviously, but the supervision rule says that the central station normally would receive a message either once a day or once an hour, however it's been set up. But I'm going on the assumption that if you got 2 lines today, you're going to have 2 lines tomorrow. If you got 1 line today, you'll have 1 line tomorrow. And you're just lifting and laying. You're replacing one pathway with a different one. 1 hour supervision on a fire service, typically, if it has a single line, it wants the alarm panel normally would call the central station once an hour and say, I'm alive. It's just, I'm alive call. And if the central station, which is supervising the signal, doesn't get that signal, then it says, there's something wrong here. And then they take steps. They start making phone calls, or if it goes too many hours, they have to send a guard or somebody out to do a fire watch, that kind of thing. There's a whole bunch of rules that happen. You got to enunciate locally and just a number of things that happen. But normally, single line devices call on fire service, call in once an hour. Once a day.
Got it.
24. That's typical. Now, certain jurisdictions could be different. I've got one jurisdiction in the United States that we found. It's the city of Moses Lake, Washington, passed a city ordinance. It's different than the NFPA 72. It's different than UL. It just basically says you're going to have two phone lines, one of which can be cellular, and they're both going to call in once an hour. I don't care. And that's in the ordinance of the city, which is, okay, you can do that. The 9090 has a battery internal battery on board, so it can provide the statement that we make at Data Remote is it provides up to 12 hours of standby battery. Now, we've done some testing, load testing in the lab, and batteries are a function of how much you use them. And so when we've tested them in the lab, if they're under heavy duty usage, which is placing one call a minute, it'll last for 12 hours. If it's medium usage, it'll go 14, and if it's light usage, it'll go 16. Now the 9010 device will go 24. It's got two batteries in it. So if your requirement for powering, typically fire service likes longer than 8 hours. We make a recommendation normally that if you need a 24-hour backup, you provide an interruptible power supply to augment what's available on the device to give you 24, if that's what your needs are. But the device in its native form will give you 12 with heavy usage, heavy loading. It comes standard as a single, but it has an optional auxiliary battery pack that fits into the other side of the case. It's all internal, and it will give you 24 if you need it. No, single box. So again, if you think in terms of network equipment, so I'm thinking a phone line coming to the business. If that phone line fails, what do? You go to the second phone line. So what if the cable gets hit, telephone pole gets knocked down in the street in front of the building, takes all the cables out? That's your single point of failure on the network side. But if you look at it on the other side of the house, if I'm on the customer side of the house, then a lot of fire marshals say I can't have a single point of failure, so I'll let you use a cellular dialer for one and a landline for the second, if you will. Or you need to have two cellular dialers. But again, in that instance, cell goes down, that's your single point of failure for both of them. Although we know that cellular is robust enough that if one cell tower is down, you have other cell towers to back you up usually. But remember, we're network equipment, so it's a single box, but it's no different than a single cable coming into the building. And when you do have a failure, either one or both, it will enunciate locally and tell you that you're out of comms. Not unlike a central office line would do if it was cut. Software switch, when they configure it, you flip it and it says, okay, drop voltage on loss of and if loss of, actually a couple things happen. On loss of registration, meaning if it's no longer talking on the network, it drops voltage because it's not communicating. And so elevator type phones and alarm systems have always depended traditionally on phone line cut. What happens? Negative 48 volt is gone. The panel senses that and it trips a trouble signal at the keypad or wherever. It'll enunciate locally, you've lost comms. So it makes good sense that if the registration is lost, meaning it's no longer talking, whether the cell tower is down or whether the internet is down or both, then you want to drop voltage on both lines, in which case then you're out of service. There's another thing that happens too, and this is integral to the product. When it loses registration, or when it switches from primary to secondary, or switches back from secondary to primary when primary is restored, it sends an alert in the form of either an email or a text message to whomever it's been programmed to tell. So somebody's going to get alerted that registration's down, we're now on backup on secondary, or registration's restored, primary's back up, you get that, or if you go on battery, loss of AC power, it's going to send a message. So that's kind of a network thing that's over and above everything else. It's part of the supervision of the tech. And that could go to the central station, it could go to the property manager, it could go to whomever you'd like. And that's what we think is a very positive thing. So that's in addition to dropping the bolting. An AHJ, probably, I haven't run across one yet, but AHJs do what they like to do, and they may want it spray painted pink. And so, yeah, that's probably a reality. We maintain that the installation should be done where it's easiest to install, where you have access to the entry facilities coming into the building so that you can lift and lay cabling from the network side of the network interface at DMARC. If you're using an RJ21X in a building, it would go on the net side. We've got an underground coming in with a protector. It's going to go on the protector side, not on the customer side. It could be in the same building as or same room as the alarm panel. I was just in a installation in my neck of the woods. I'm out in the Seattle area, and they put one in a grocery store. And the alarm equipment was located in one room, and all the telecom stuff was in another room. And so they put it in the telecom room because that was the easiest to access the cable. They didn't have to touch the alarm panel in any way, shape, or form. They simply swapped pairs at the entry in, and they had access to power and backup power. Whereas in the alarm room, they didn't have any of that. So again, individual case basis, but no hard requirement that it be next to the alarm panel. So most of them all near where the telco entry facilities come in. Well, I don't know if protected locations have smoke detectors in telco rooms or not. That's a good question. I would assume in a protected building that the building is protected from fire. So all areas should have, I would think, smoke detectors. But again, you could bring a 6 or 110 block in and put your own in, but in the main, what's going to happen when you disconnect, you get in all buildings, there's going to be an entry facility, either the underheads coming into some fashion, and typically there's a protector, which is, in the old days it was carbon block fuses, and today it could be just about anything, and that protector. In fact, I got a graphic on something. I'm gonna show you a quick graphic that may help. This is really old, guys. This is this is vintage 1975, 1980, but this shows a lot of the stuff that's out there. So what I want you to look at is the yellow line running kind of up and down the middle of the piece of wood. You all see that?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. On the left side of that line is telco. On the right side of the line is considered the demarcation point between telco and customer. So if you'll notice in the bottom of the picture, there's there's actually 3 of them. There's 366 blocks on the bottom of the picture. The one on the far left is designated as from the telco underground. And in the olden days, the early days of registered jacks, when the phone company had to be the only people on the planet that could install them, you see in that rendering, there's a gray colored RJ31X telco installed block between the underground or the entry facilities on the left and designated as an RJ21X, which is basically a 66 block with a means of disconnecting the customer wiring from it. And then if the alarm company puts in the RJ31X, it's on the right-hand side of the standard network interface, or DMARC. And so to answer your question, normally I would be wiring coming off the 66 block on the inbound, the telco side, and I would simply lay it down there, and then it feeds the house. It feeds the cabling in the building as an entry facility, providing dial tone. In a where this first came to be, the first POTS in a box devices that went out through AT&T. So it was kind of a non-issue. They were doing it. It's like it didn't matter. Now they're nationwide, and there's a lot of places that don't have an AT&T footprint for wired service. There's Verizon has a footprint, and CenturyLink and Frontier and others. So to answer your question, the telco wiring comes into the building, and then it feeds the house wiring. So the question of the hour is, where's your point of attachment? And I would argue that if I took the wires off of the detector or the carbon protector or the 66 block, wherever DMARC point was, and said that's the first connection into the building, you'd be safe to do it there. If you're asking me, can you literally lift the telco wiring off of the network interface and lay this down? And my answer is, well, if telco is no longer providing the dial tone, if the central office doesn't exist anymore, then you're taking over that. And so in that instance, yes, you could. Although then there's the argument of who owns the block. But if the telco's out of there, then it's abandoned in place and you can use it. If you're nervous about it or you feel good about it, then you come off the telco block to an intermediary 66 block, which you define as the standard network interface. And then everything is fed off of that block, but you're still the upstream source of the dial tone. In no case should you be down into the RJ31 on pins 4 and 5, although your wiring ultimately will end up there, but you're upstream from that. So it's we found some situations where the telephone company is no longer there. They've discontinued the dial tone. Under forbearance, they're getting out of the dial tone business. So now we're into the argument of where does the network start? So you are the network. With this box, you become the functional network. And so the easiest way to do it is that you wire the network comes into the building. If you're uncomfortable with that, then create a new network interface. It says, okay, here's the new NI. It's a 66 block. There's no telco involved anymore. We're on one side, customers on the other side. You're the telco. So you designate that 66 block as the standard network interface, SNI. It's the demarcation block that defines what is network and what is customer. For me, if I were doing it, if I was in charge and I was king and I could do anything I wanted to do, I would buy a 66 block with a Amphenol plug on the side of it. That's called an RJ21X. And I would get the red cover. I showed you the picture of it. It had a fluorescent red cover over the face of it. And that's labeled as an RJ21X, which is a standard FCC registered jack for disconnecting customer equipment and isolating customer equipment from the network. And that block becomes a de facto standard network interface. And failing the Amphenol connector on the side, because then what happens is You come off the Amphenol to another 66 block, and then you feed the house from there, which is a lot of extra work. So if you label something as the standard network interface vis-a-vis the new 66 block, then that's the NI, that's the demarcation. And if you look to the left of that, there would be no telco involvement, no telco lines, nothing going to the street, no cabling, no carbon protectors, none of that. It becomes the network demarcation. And that's really all the FCC has ever done is tried to come up with a standardized way of defining what's telco and what's not. You're got to be thinking you're telco, you're the network. Technically, to be a registered jack, it has to have a means of disconnecting customer equipment. It's a network interface between network side of the house and customer side of the house. And yeah. That's really the only function. In fact, there's one of them that's, they use them in apartments and what have you. Sometimes they're built into the actual customer jack, and there's a little RJ11 you can unplug and isolate. The whole idea was being able to isolate what's downstream for testing. But in this new world, the POTS network, POTS network, plain old telephone service network, is being supplanted by the MFVN, Managed Facilities Voice Network, which is basically the internet. And so some different kinds of rules happen to apply. And if you go look up UL's definition, they actually have a definition of MFVN and of POTS both. But in both instances, there has to be a division point between what's the network provider and what's the customer. That's the definition. Whatever you designate. So, okay. So it's the idea is that it's a designation block. Okay. And you can buy them with a clear plastic cover or with a orange cover. Yeah. The orange typically was designation for the demarker network interface. Those are available. In all of the experiences that I've had in North America, there was only one instance, that was Moses Lake, Washington, where we were required to leave one landline in because that was the AHJ. In all other instances, both at a state level and at a local level, once we sit down and explain to the fire marshal, hey, this is why you're not seeing the UL 864 on it. That's the first thing. The second thing is go look up 60950-1. Look it up, and you'll see fire service is mentioned under note number 2 as one of the applications. And generally they look at that and they look at where it's wired and the fact that it's providing dial tone versus a dialer. Remember that, you know, some of the traditional alarm DAC communicators that have been out there, they initiate and they call a number. This box doesn't do that. It provides the pathway for those things to work and completes over the public switch network. So to answer your question, once we've explained it in depth to a fire marshal and educated them, it's a non-issue. And when they see the UL 60950-1, they look it up themselves, they see the footnote, it's approved. So I've yet to have one turned down by a fire marshal anywhere other than Moses Lake demanded at least one landline. That's the only one I've ever found. No, they're isolated. They're each one's isolated. So if I plugged in eight devices and had alarm on 2 of them and 6 of them had fax machines and telephones and modems and other things, and they were all in use, doesn't matter. They're all independent of one another. I'm going to throw one more thing out here that's important. And there's a standard feature that's built into the device that's an auto configure. So when you plug in an alarm system and you get it all wired up and then you send a test signal, the first signal that goes through that port, first time you dial out, the box, if it's in auto configure, listens to the information it's receiving. And it says, ah, this is contact ID. And it configures it. Or this is SIA, it configures it. You plug a butt set into it and make a couple of voice calls to see if it works. It's going to assume that it's voice. And when you plug the alarm system into it, it's not going to work because it's thinking it's voice. It's not set up for contact ID. So the cautionary tale here is, if you follow the instructions, don't plug your butt set in and play with it. Hook it up, and when it's all lashed up, run your test, and it'll do just fine. Well, in the world of data communications, voice behaves differently than modem. Modem behaves differently than fax. Fax behaves differently than alarm. So you've all monitored phone calls before, and you can tell the difference between a voice and a modem. You know what an FSK sounds like. You know what a voice sounds like. Alarm tones are in certain sequences. The timing is different. If it's an older alarm system and it's using a 4+2, or it's going to be different each time. And so the network has to adjust dynamically, it has to adjust for timing, length of message, parity, all of the kinds of things that go with that signal. It has to set it up for that, because in a world of internet, because ultimately this all goes by the internet, whether it's cellular as the front door or whether it's a wide area network as the front door, it ultimately gets broken down into a whole bunch of ones and zeros and sent through the network and then reconstructed on the other end. And actually it dials out a 10-digit phone number from the host to complete the call. It's got to know what it's receiving and what format it's in. And so there's a whole bunch of alarm formats out there. In the olden days, radionics behaved differently than a Demco did. It was just different formats. And so the device has to make sure that it's configured correctly to pass the necessary information in the correct timing. I don't like to do anything. I believe in total transparency. And if a fire marshal finds that you've been sneaking around in the dark doing something, they might get unhappy with you. So I would always let them know what you're doing. And in some instances, they're going to want a permit. And if they do, you pull a permit and you hook it up and you test it and have them put their check mark on it. Could you just go in and switch the lines? Yeah, you could. And I'm sure everything will be just fine. But I personally, I don't do anything without telling them what I'm doing. That's just me. Pull a permit, let them, or just call them and tell them. They may want a permit. I would suspect they. The big thing you're going to run into with the fire marshals is they've all been trained to look for UL 864 on the dialer. That's been hammered into them. It's not a dialer. And so there's an education process. And once they understand it and it's network side, they got it. But I would most definitely communicate with the local jurisdiction having authority, the AHJ, and say, phone lines are going away, so we're reconfiguring the telephone network, and you may want to come by and run some tests. You put the alarm system in test mode, and then you send a signal. But you're always better to be transparent. Well, no, normally what's happening is you're not doing something new, you're simply replacing existing. So nothing should be any different. If they're doing it every 6 hours today, then they do it every 6 hours today. If they're getting one today, then they programmed into their their automation system. It's like, if you've been involved with central stations, there's something called an opening and closing supervised alarm, where they're looking for the business to disarm the system at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they're looking for the business to rearm the system at 10 o'clock at night. And they know that if those things happen the way they're supposed to, there's harmony in the universe and there's no foul, no problem. If they miss a check-in for that 8 o'clock opening, then they have a procedure that says if it doesn't happen within 15 minutes, call somebody to say your system didn't get disarmed. And it's same thing at closing. If it gets disarmed at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's an automatic, this is not supposed to happen, somebody gets alerted. If you have 2 phone lines today and you're going to eliminate one of the phone lines, then your statement is correct. However, if they have 2 lines today, they're going to have 2 lines tomorrow. And where your confusion, I think, is coming in is you're saying, yes, but this device is a single point of failure. It's only one. It's no different than the single wire coming into the building from the telephone pole. Take that wire out, you're out of service. So
yeah. So to restate, I think it's if you're replacing the phone lines and whatever the fire panel's normally checking in as, it all stays the same. If there's a different requirement to check in more often, 1, it has to be coordinated with the central station, and 2, it has to be programmed to make those calls on the fire panel at a higher frequency or whatever the frequency is. So yes, both sides need to know about it.
yes,
The device has nothing to do with it.
correct. Device
Exactly.
will do as it's
You're
told.
right. But this device would give you the opportunity to make a change in a path. You could, using this device, go to
Potentially, yes.
single path. Yeah, that's why.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
But I think Data Remote's position is this is the functional equivalent of POTS. So it's not considering, we're not saying, hey, it's now a cellular soul path. Cellular soul path is the definition of an alarm communicator. This is just, hey, this is a different, like he's, oh, you got a single cable coming into the building. This is network equipment. It's totally unrelated. It's not a cellular communicator. It's not subject to that cellular soul path because they're saying it's just like POTS. And that's what the UL listing is saying. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's actually, you could even argue that potentially it's better than the central office line, because if I have a wide area network internet connection and a cellular connection, I've actually got diverse routing now. I've got redundancy and diverse routing because I'm not using one medium to carry the traffic. I'm using 2. Kind of like having 2 entry facilities coming into a building.